Hello, my name is Kennedy Miller. This year I was in educational psychology, in which I learned many different aspects of psychology that I can use in my future classroom. Throughout this Pecha Kucha, I will be explaining to you the parts of educational psychology that I found to be the most important and will explain how I will use these concepts in my future classroom. Before getting into any of the concepts of ed psych, it is important to understand the importance of an intentional teacher. An intentional teacher makes decisions based on their students' needs. For example, I will plan my lessons and activities based on what fits my students' needs rather than what is the easiest for me. In the end, this creates meaningful learning for all students. A theorist known as Vygotsky had created the idea that students learn through social interactions and culture. The environment and people that students are surrounded by are the biggest influence to a student's education. For example, when a student is guided by a teacher or working with peers, their understanding of certain concepts increases. In my future classroom, I will use Vygotsky's idea of zone of proximal development to understand what my students can do on their own and what they can do with assistance. When I see that a student may be struggling, I will scaffold, or in other words, mentor and support my student to help them become more independent. Every student has a different background and may be struggling in different areas. Another cognitive development theorist was Jean Piaget, who believed that children develop in 4 stages: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. Each stage represents a student's ability and how you can support them. Piaget believed that children make connections in what they already know with new information being learned. Understanding what stage my students may be in will help me understand how I will make changes to my instruction based on the students' cognitive abilities. In my future classroom, I will make my lessons meet my students' learning needs and challenge them accordingly. You never know. One student in my class may be struggling with simple math, but another may be accelerated. Another theorist, named Bandura, had a theory called the social learning theory. He believed that children actually learned through observing others. They will go through Bandura's phases of attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation, which means they will recognize a behavior, remember it, copy it, and model it. Behaviors are shaped by what students pay attention to. This theory will help me understand why my students behave the way that they do and what I can do to fix behavior. For example, a child may watch classmates they look up to break the rules and may then begin breaking the rules as well. In my future classroom, I will need to make sure I am a positive role model because I need to understand that my students are observing my actions as well. Continuing on with behavior, we have operant conditioning, which is when behavior is followed by consequences, such as reinforcements and punishments. Behaviors being rewarded are more likely to be repeated, while behaviors being punished are less likely to be repeated. There are both positive and negative reinforcements and punishments, positive meaning you add something and negative taking something away. Understanding this theory, I can choose consequences that properly fit behaviors in my classroom. I may use tokens, praise, stickers, or classroom privileges to reinforce positive behavior. For unwanted behavior, consequences might be losing the privilege of something the students desire. Using constant reinforcement will help build expectations for my students to follow. A man named Kohlberg had 3 levels of moral reasoning: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional, with 2 stages in each. These stages help show why a person has the moral decisions that they do based on their age. For example, younger children may follow rules to avoid punishment, while other children may follow rules because they value responsibility. Understanding what levels my students fall in will help me understand my students' ethical reasonings during specific situations. I can understand why some of my students react or perform in these situations. Knowing what level my students are in will help me create the learning environment that my students should be in by supporting them in making better decisions. As students get older, they hit James Marsh's stages of identity development: diffusion, foreclosure, moratorium, and identity achievement. He believes that as we get older, our beliefs change. For example, a student in moratorium may be exploring who they are, while a student in foreclosure may follow beliefs without questioning them. The stage you fall into right now may change. As a future educator, I can understand where my students are and how I can support them based on their personal beliefs. I can respect their cultures, values, and backgrounds, creating a safe and accepting environment no matter what status my student is in. I will give encouragement and acceptance to each and every one of my students' beliefs. Being a student at any age, you are going to have to use many different study techniques. One that I found to be very important was space study. Space study is a study technique where you spread studying out over a period of time rather than cramming information into one single study sesh. As a procrastinator, I find that I often do better when I take time studying. I will apply my knowledge of this information in my future classroom by teaching my students the space study technique. I can help each of my students create plans for their studying, hoping that they follow it. I can work with my students by adjusting their study plans for their needs and what works best for them. They will overall allow for better performance within my students. Another study technique that I found to be very important was retrieval practice. Retrieval practice is a strategy where you consistently think about information that you have already learned by memory, rather than reviewing it. I find this practice important because it helps you improve long-term retention of certain information. In my future classroom, I will use things like flashcards, practice tests, exit tickets, brain dumps, and more to allow my students to go back and recall past information that they have just recently learned without looking up the information. This allows for students to think about what they don't know or what they can't remember and gives them time to spend more time on that specific topic. I find these two study techniques to be most beneficial because they help learned information stick with students. Using study techniques helps students remember more, allowing them to see real progress in their work. This progress gives students motivation to keep working hard. They feel capable of doing well, making them willing to continue studying hard. All of these theories and strategies help me understand what it means to be an intentional teacher. I will make proper decisions based on each of my students' needs. I will also be deliberate about my planning to create supportive environments, rather than a one-size-fits-all method, creating a higher learning potential for my students.